Well, it's an absolute pleasure to be joined by Nigel Topping. Nigel Topping is the high-level change action champion for COP26. Nigel, welcome. Maybe just to kick this off, it'd be great to just get in your own words what the role involved.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks, Richard. It's lovely to join you. Yeah, I mean, this grandly titled role of high-level climate action champion was created as part of the Paris Agreement. The idea being that the countries recognized that tackling the climate crisis is such a big deal and so complicated that national governments can't do it on their own and need kind of a whole of society approach. So the role of the champions is to work with particularly the private sector and if like subnational government, but remembering that there's some very big actors in the private sphere, both finance and business, as well as non-national governments. If you think of California, it's the fifth biggest economy in the world, or cities, whether it's Mumbai or London or Tokyo, huge economies, and rule-making ability in their own right. So the idea is that the high-level champions work with that community of non-state actors, as the UN calls them, to drive ambition and action on climate change to support countries to go further and faster.
Fantastic. It was particularly noticeable, Nigel, at COP26, the private sector really turned up in force and really were one of the real collaborators there. How do you see the role of the private sector in driving the sustainability change in the economy?
Well, I mean, first of all, there will be no change without the private sector, because the private sector is a kind of the implementer of much that happens in society, right? I mean, for good or for real. So, I mean, the most emissions come from the private sector, and most of the solutions are coming and will come from the private sector. So the first thing is there is no solution without private sector being fully mobilized. I think secondly, the private sector has some unique qualities, like it's big, the private sector, right? And it evolves, and it tends to, markets work through a kind of evolutionary algorithm. So there's all sorts of experimentation going on at any one time. So at any given time, there are some people in the private sector who are way more ambitious than the public sector. And what we're really trying to tap into is that fact that the more there are a leading group of private sector actors in any sector more ambitious than national governments, actually that starts to change the politics. Because when a national government sees steel companies and shipping companies and car companies committing and going faster than they had the maybe the political ability to regulate, then they can be more ambitious themselves. And we see that in sector after sector now, so that the private sector, as well as being the implementer of solutions, can be much more agile and faster and more ambitious than the public sector, and therefore can change the politics. So that's really what we saw in Glasgow. I think for the first time, that political interaction between ambitious, innovative private sector met the need to be more ambitious from the public sector, but that is constrained by the amount of freedom. If you're a politician, right, you can't go too much further than the private sector, because then you'll have a big backlash. So the private sector can enable bolder policy making. That's what we saw in Glasgow.
Amazing. I mean, it is that whole set of players that need to come together to make this happen. And obviously the COP26 is a huge moment for that. And over the last couple of years, you've hit some really significant milestones with things like Race to Zero, Race to Resilience. And it'd be great just to get your own personal experience of seeing all those different actors go through their own journey, because we're all feeling the pace is getting faster, which is fantastic. We're all feeling the future's coming quicker towards us, but we're all recognizing that, so many things need to come together. And it starts with, some of the ambition and attitudes. And how have you seen those attitudes, particularly in the private sector, shift over this period of time since you've had the role?
Well, I think we've passed, in the last 2 years, been a very interesting time to be in this role, because we passed through an inflection point where, we've had some private sector actors taking this change very seriously for some time, but others maybe waiting on the sidelines, maybe knowing that it's coming, but not knowing what to do, or being worried about going too soon. Of course, we've had laggards and people trying to slow things down as well. But I think what's happened in the last 2 years is there's been a shift in so many different parts of society. So the science has got much clearer and more strident in saying we've really got to changes, and that started in October 2018, really, with the report saying how much more economic and human damage there is at 2 degrees compared to 1.5 degrees. And with the recent reports, it's just that voice is getting ever stronger. Also, I think just watching the news the last couple of years, we just had more and more wildfires, floods, droughts, heat stress events. So I think it's become impossible now to think that climate change is something which will happen to someone else a couple of decades in the future. It's self-evidently happening now. We've also seen a real social uprising with Fridays for the Future and Extinction Rebellion. That changes the politics as well, when voters and future voters in particular, future employees, future customers, and the technology technologies. We continue to make progress on technology. So I think a lot of things, the science, the social pressure, so we've now started. It's got easier and easier and easier to believe that we can do it, and more pressure to commit to do it. So that combination of the need to respond to science and social pressures and the belief in our ability to innovate are kind of coming together. So now, and I think now we're in the sort of second iteration of real bold commitments where companies, I always talk about Maersk and Mercedes, who 3 or 4 years ago, but Maersk committed to net zero 2050 and Mercedes net zero 2039. And within a few years of, these are big engineering kind of led enterprises, right? So within and this is a big engineering challenge, how on earth do we change the energetic source for our economy? In both cases, within a few years, they've taken 10 years off their targets, because as their talented engineers get into it, they're like, oh, we can do this faster. And not only can we do it faster, there's going to be a competitiveness advantage from doing it faster. So that's why I think it's been a really exciting 2 years. I think now going forward, what we're seeing is the beginning of implementation at scale, whether it's investment in green hydrogen, green steel, continuing investment in renewables, probably accelerated by the Ukraine war, right? As people realize just how reliant they are on Russian hydrocarbons. So I think been a real sea change in the last 2 years, and I think now we're going to see this decade just really take off.
Yeah, you mentioned something there, Nigel, which I just want to pick up on, which is, this switch between having a corporate lean into sustainability because it's the right thing to do, or there's a cost and implication of an action, or there's potential regulation, into actually there's a competitive advantage of going earlier, going faster, going larger, and making that capital work in the right direction. Have you seen that sort of shift over the last 2 years as well? People moving from sort of, I need to make a response, to actually it's an advantage for me to really lean in a meaningful way.
Yeah, and when you're dealing with a sort of secular disruption to a given sector, and this one's affecting nearly every sector, it's very difficult to get the timing right. I mean, because things are going to go from 0 to 100 in say the next 20 years. But if you invest too much too soon, you can waste a lot of capital, and if you don't get on the learning curve fast enough, you can lose a chunk of market share that you never get back. So it's very difficult. So I understand why, and that's why you need all these other signals all lining up. Like employees, customers, science, policymakers, because that starts to de-risk the transition. But I think the other thing that's changed is, and still sometimes I find myself quite often challenging the way this transition is framed, because I mean there is a moral element, right? There is a intergenerational justice element. But I think still when people frame this as an ESG issue or as a responsible finance issue, as a green finance issue, they're almost always framing it in a weak way. And I always say, look, if you're a steel company or an automotive company or a power company, this is not an ESG committee or a sustainability committee topic. This is you're discussing this in the boardroom, and you're making major capex and product portfolio and M&A and appointment decisions on the basis of the need to get this transition right. So I think we need to be very careful not to bundle this up with lots of other issues as an ESG issue when it's in fact driving massive disruption and therefore massive value creation and value destruction, depending on whether you get that right.
Yeah, and the consumer, you mentioned the public positive sort of sentiment of the public there as well. That consumer shift obviously happens at different speeds and different flavors depending on which part of the world that you're based in. I mean, that response we saw in the plastic shift was quite tremendous and created a whole pace. Broadening that out, how do you see the sort of consumer sentiment changing and that playing a role again for private sector to, increase their pace and response to meet that requirement?
Well, I think that the early adopters who are prepared to pay more or search high and low for the low carbon product have done their job, but they don't make a whole market, right? They give enough incentive to test things. So I think where we're at now is that we won't get mass adoption if we don't get quality and pricing right. I mean, so you'll hear a lot of people say they'll buy an electric vehicle when the price is right. So people want, and I think what most people want is for governments and brands to sort the problem out, because it's really complicated. And I want to know that, my brands and my governments have fixed the problem and it's not really going to affect my life that much. So you start to see that in like meat alternatives, as those products get better and cheaper, people try them out and they know they're healthier and better for the environment. So they try them out and they're like, oh, actually, they're really quite good. So they have to be good quality and get the right price point. And we're seeing that with electric vehicles from a fleet procurement perspective, because the total cost of ownership argument is there. But of course, we need the sticker price to get right, really, for mass public adoption. But again, that's coming, right? I've just seen the latest UK government predictions, which will get to like 63% market share in the next 4 years for electric vehicles. So I think that's again, it's one of the, I've talked a lot about this. These changes nearly always happen exponentially, right? So it takes a long time to start really getting down the cost curve and up the acceptance curve. But I think that pretty much every sector we're seeing that kind of dynamic really taking off this decade. I mentioned green hydrogen. We launched the Green Hydrogen Catapult in December 2020 with 7 major energy players committing to 25 gigawatts by 2026. That's what we calculated was needed to be on the curve towards $1 a kilogram by 2030. And within a year, they'd increased their target by 80% to 45 gigawatts by 2026 and to 800 gigawatts by 2030. Just like crazy numbers. And just last week, Fortescue Minerals did a big deal with E.ON to provide green hydrogen to Germany. So that industry has gone from being kind of prototypes and proof of concept to, major energy provider. Okay, that's a 5 to 10 year pipeline in terms of the investment, right? You can't switch it on overnight. But that's the sort of thing we're seeing is in every one of these sectors, we're now seeing mainstream chunks of capex. Green steel, ArcelorMittal building 2 factories in, I think, Spain and Belgium that have 2 million tons of green steel each. So that sort of stuff is happening now. No one was really doing that in these new sectors like steel, shipping, hydrogen a couple of years ago.
No, it is. I mean, it's been tremendous to watch the hydrogen as an example of that sort of exponential growth and coming forwards. And like you say, only a few years ago, we probably had put the sort of $1 a kilo in the fantasy sort of for quite some decades, and now we're seeing it really today.
And to your point about consumers, you're starting to see major sort of consumer-facing companies like IKEA and Walmart say they're only going to buy, for example, zero carbon shipping. So it's a lot to ask for a consumer to figure out whether their product has been shipped in a low carbon way, because that's a small part of the value chain. But it's not a lot to ask for a consumer to expect that their retailer, whether it's IKEA or not, has taken care of that for them. So I think that's the sort of thing that we see as people coming together to use their procurement power on behalf of the consumer, seeing that is increasingly a demand of the consumer. And you can't expect the consumer to make those decisions based on a complex label that explains where the steel came from, where the shipping, what fuel the shipping used, etc. Yeah. That's to be taken care of in the sort of B2B procurement sphere on behalf of consumers, though.
Fantastic. Nigel, I noticed that you were in the Middle East North Africa Climate Week in March. Obviously an important region, an important topic now coming up on the agenda, being both a producer but also a region that has implications from climate change. What were your main takeaways from the time of Climate Week there?
Well, a couple. First of all, there's, compared to a couple of years ago, an incredible sophistication and commitment to the transition, right? So Saudi Arabia is committed to net zero 2060, and a lot of people there are talking about net zero 2050 because they kind of know the whole world's going there. And interestingly, both Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are states run by engineers who know big finance. It's kind of interesting, right? Because what we need to make this transition is some very complex engineering and an awful lot of money. So one of the things I left thinking was, actually, I'm really glad these countries are now turning their attention to the solution, and in a very, very sophisticated way. So they are investing in carbon capture, but not just carbon capture and storage, carbon capture and utilization, and using some of their chemical and petrochemical engineering skills to derive useful products, whether it's synfuels or building materials. And of course, they're also that region is also hugely blessed with lots of land and very hot sun, which brings its own problems, but also means that they're all starting to see themselves as winning from the transition because they're going to be producing the cheapest energy, the cheapest hydrogen, the cheapest green ammonia. So when I was in Egypt earlier in the year, the head of the Suez Canal Zone was saying, like you, that a year ago he thought, hydrogen was a science fiction answer, but now they're building green hydrolysis, green electrolysis capacity in the canal zone and making green ammonia, because Maersk have said they're going to be net zero 2040. So if you want Maersk, which is 20% of, I think 20% of all container shipping goes through Suez Canal, Maersk market leaders. So if you want them to bunker green ammonia, then you better be making it. And of course, they've got a lot of desert to do it. So I think that's one thing, is that we've now got serious money and technical competence looking at solutions, which I would say is not necessarily the case a few years ago. Although there's been notable exceptions, like Mazda in the UAE has been innovating, and Irene has been based in the UAE for a long time. But I don't think we've seen the political support at the top level now. The other interesting thing is that the Gulf countries, and I'll include Egypt there, see themselves as Arabic, so Middle Eastern, but also as a kind of hub between South and Central Asia, Eastern Sub-Saharan Africa, and North Africa, and Europe. So if you just shift your perspective to looking at the world from their point of view, they also see a huge need to engage with many of the vulnerable countries in that broader region, who are being most affected, so in Sub-Saharan Africa and Central Asia. So I think it'd be very interesting to see how that aspect of a Egyptian, then an Emirati COP presidency plays out in terms of us learning what they can do in terms of showing leadership for a different group of countries than often get the limelight at a COP.
No, it sounds like a very positive. I mean, it's the first ever climate week for that region, so it sounds like a very positive step forwards. Good momentum towards COP27, hopefully in Egypt.
Yeah, and very well organised and very well attended. I mean, the Emiratis are also very smart. They put it on at the same time as they had a World Government Summit, so there were lots of CEOs and ministers in town who could combine both events. But yeah, I think it does bode well for the next 2 years.
Yeah. You mentioned the economics changing there, and from the work that we've done, we are seeing now the economics when we look at the cost curves, the forecast forwards, the ability to create scale to actually hit price points that, in your example there, the hydrogen to synthetic fuels, ammonia being a key one, obviously. As you look at any of those, they need a huge amount of collaboration. And you talk a lot about the radical collaboration and 3 simple rules that start to bring this together. It would be lovely to sort of hear your perspectives on those 3 rules, how it comes together, and just how does that work, and bring these different parties together that need to make this happen in a credible way.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because there's a need for huge collaboration and huge competition as well. So we're finding out how to do both. And that's interestingly, I think Silicon Valley's figured that out. There's huge collaboration in Silicon Valley. There's a real sense of being part of an ecosystem. But of course, people are also operating individually and competing at the same time. I mean, I think in terms of this collaboration, the first thing is you have to know where you're going, and that's both in terms of the sort of pathway, like the steps. What does everyone have to do? And we're seeing really good collaboration along that. Things like the Getting to Zero coalition for shipping, where you need the fuel producers, the port operators, the shipping manufacturers, the cargo owners, and the cargo, so the shipping operators and the cargo owners. Like I mentioned, the zero carbon vessels alliance from people like IKEA and Walmart. So you need that kind of shared pathway, and then you need to recognise that what drives the overall change is the feedback between all those different, what we call the ambition loop, right? And so that, the demand signal impacts the supply side, but that happens the other way around as well. Customers impact the whole value chain. The technology capability and technologists saying we're confident we can get the fuel price down to $1 a kilogram changes the way people think. The policy. So just recognize that everybody, this is systemic, and these ambition loops are everywhere, and so it's not just no one actor can drive the change. It's the whole system. And I think most importantly is committing to what I call an exponential interim target. So I mentioned the hydrogen, that kind of going from 25 to 45 to 800, or with sustainable aviation fuel, which in 2020 was 0.01% of the mix. Getting everybody to commit to at least 10% by 2030. 10% doesn't sound like much, but 1,000x sounds like a lot, right? So again, you look at the rate of change rather than the absolute. And once you're on that trajectory, like you've got to 10% by 1,000xing the volume, you've got the costs down, then getting to 100% the next decade starts to look quite easy, right? Because you figured out how to get to scale. So those kind of rules, recognizing these ambition loops are really important, and that everybody's influencing everybody else. Having a kind of a clear pathway that's shared, that's the real importance of collaboration. I used the example of telecoms, where we're all moving from 4G to 5G, and that describes a pre-competitively agreed technology pathway, which allows the whole industry to move much faster. And I mean, they compete like hell amongst themselves, right? But within an agreed pathway. So yeah, the ambition loops, the shared roadmaps, and then those exponential goals. And the exponential goals, it becomes like a Moore's law, which is not a law. Gordon Moore asserted something, which was a belief in our ability to keep innovating. And when enough people believe in something like that and all work towards it, it becomes self-fulfilling. It's not a law of physics, right? It's so similarly, it's not a law of sustainable aviation fuel that will get to 10% by 2030. But if everybody believes we will, commits to it and invests in it, then we'll probably overshoot it. So that interim exponential goal that really drives the innovation, I think, is perhaps the most important of those three rules, if you like.
I love it, and I love the framing and the sort of radical collaboration. It's certainly, I mean, from anything that we work on in this area, there is always more than one party required to really shift at the pace that we all see the opportunity as. Now we're coming close to time. There's obviously one question which we've got to finish on. You're leading out the COP26. What would you like to see in COP27? What would you like to see as some of the outcomes there?
The number one thing I'd like to see is everybody who's committed in Glasgow demonstrating their commitment through their capex allocation. That's where the rubber hits the road. You can talk about being committed to transforming your business forever, but until you're actually making decisions to allocate resources, then it's just words. So what I really want to see is the billions of dollars being allocated into new green steel factories, more green hydrogen, shifting fleets from combustion engines to electric vehicles in every sector, making sure that we're actually driving the transition and putting our money where our mouth is.
Fantastic. Nigel, it's been an absolute pleasure to be able to have this conversation with you. Thank you very much for sharing your perspectives on both, driving through COP26 and now looking into the future as well. It's fantastic. And I'm also looking forward to the next sessions now. We're going to have colleague Angela on the next session. But just once again, thank you very much for joining us.
Right, it's a pleasure, Richard. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nigel.